Okay, yeah, welcome everybody. So today we're going to talk about this paper, The Neuron as a Direct Data-Driven Controller by Moore et al. And I'm very excited to announce that the last author, the senior author of this paper, Mitya Chklovskii, has joined us today. And we're going to discuss this paper, and Mitya is going to share some recent progress on this paper in their group and this line of work. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of a break in the series of debates we were having about reinforcement learning. So this is not officially part of that debate, but I think it's actually conceptually very, very overlapping and a very interesting idea to bring agency down to the level of neuron. So before we start to talk about the actual paper, I wanted to ask Mitya about his background and what led him to come up with this philosophy of bringing control theory down to the level of neurons. So Mitya, I know that you started from this matter physics and then switched to neuroscience. Can you tell us a little bit about your trajectory and how was it like for you to make this transition?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. Thanks for talking about our paper. I got my PhD in theoretical physics, and then I did a postdoc at the Harvard Society of Fellows, where basically we didn't have a residency requirement, but we had dinners with people in other disciplines every week. And I started to realize that, physics isn't everything, and there are other exciting things out there. And I had a lot of interesting chats with the likes of, Nobel laureates like Wally Gilbert and David Hubel, and it really blew my mind. And I wasn't sure that as a physicist I would be able to contribute, but then I met, uh, a very prominent neuroscientist. Unfortunately, he died recently, Chuck Stevens, from the Salk Institute, and he convinced me to come and try it out. And so I went to the Salk Institute at the time when they had this Sloan Center, which then became Schwartz Center initiative to fund people transitioning from math and physics to neuroscience. And it was a great time to be there. I would say the perfect time. Um, Terry Sinovsky's lab was very active with a lot of smart people, and I talk a lot with Chuck. And basically, at some point, I decided to turn down faculty offers in physics that at that time was very hard to come by, to stay as a postdoc at the Salk Institute in neuroscience, which seemed really crazy, especially to my parents. But then I got a job at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, where I started the first computational neuroscience. And from there, I went on to Genelia, where I launched connectomics. And then from there, I came to the Simons Foundation's Flatiron Institute, where I'm now a group leader. That's my story.
Thanks for sharing. So I guess I have a question that's maybe, I don't know, asking for a friend type of question. So I guess when people come from physics, I also have background in physics, and one thing that is struggling is getting adjusted to the messiness of the data in real world, not just biology, in any data, right? I wonder if you also struggle with that, and how did you deal with it? Because what's striking about your work is that not only it's theory driven, there's some elegant theory there, but also it's heavily data driven as well. So how did you manage?
That's an excellent question. And in fact, it took me a while to get to to that level because, what we are trained, or what I was trained in graduate school in physics, is basically to solve um, physics problems that are based on existing equations, but for new situations.
Mhm.
Basically, that's what we were trained to do.
Mhm.
Sometimes we were trained to like write new equations, but that was kind of within very constrained framework of known physical theories.
Mhm.
And when I switched to neuroscience, I didn't realize that actually in neuroscience, there is no such framework, theoretical framework on which everyone in the field agrees. And I was kind of lost. I didn't understand what my role was. And then I started reading a little bit about the history and philosophy of science. And I was particularly influenced by Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where basically he explained that every scientific field goes through stages. And there is a pre-paradigm stage before, there is a common theoretical framework in the field on which everyone agrees. And I recognized immediately that that's where neuroscience is. So, despite the richness of experimental facts, we don't have such a theoretical framework. And then, okay, well, then you have to write down the equation. So it's like physics in 1600s, right?
Mhm.
And, I thought it was very exciting. Of course, you may luck out and become a Newton, or you may not do anything of significance. So, right, it's not guaranteed. But I was really fascinated by that prospect. And then I just started to look for a framework. And I think now I used ideas of, evolution-derived efficiency and optimality of wiring initially. And, that's kind of neat work, I think, but it's very niche, right? It's like explaining neuronal shapes and brain structures from the perspective of optimality. But I really didn't know how else I could contribute. And then when I started doing connectomics, I basically had to learn machine learning. And that's what really rewired my brain, because I understood how statistical learning functions. And then I said, well, but how does the brain do it? It can't be doing error back propagation and so on. So there must be like a biological way to do machine learning. And I completely became obsessed with that idea. So that's kind of how I how I got to this point.
That's a great arc. And now you're here telling us neurons are not doing efficient coding or like representation of reality or whatever. They're just controlling their environment. So is this a recent development in your own thinking, or have you thought about control theory for a long time? What made you come with this, come up with this idea?
Well, I actually, just to set the record straight, I'm a big fan of efficient predictive coding, information bottleneck, and so on. And I worked on this myself and continue working. And the reason I started thinking about neurons as controllers is our failure basically to take that framework further, deeper into the brain from, the sensory periphery, where it's very successful, to the central brain and brain areas and the motor side. And so I felt that something was missing, and I was influenced by the work of Daniel Walpert, actually, who thinks a lot about like linking sensory and motor sides. I realized that, for different sensory contingencies, you have to do different motor thing. And so he had this model with different blocks on the sensor side and different blocks on the motor side. But I couldn't understand how to link the corresponding modules to each other. And then it dawned on me that every neuron has to do this linkage within itself. And then, of course, another way to, come to the controller idea, you look at how many loops there are in brain circuits, like from the connectomes, like, when we completed the C. elegans connectome, there are loops upon loops upon loops. So you can't use feed-forward algorithms, and control theory gives you tools to work with loops. So, and from the evolutionary perspective, right, we evolved from single-cell organisms, right? They had to do the whole control thing, just like what our brain does now. So what are the chances that neurons gave up that power that they had? So that's why I thought, let's give them some agency.
Perfect. Yeah, that's also, I guess, the idea is that, yeah, action is central to all of the things brains do or logical systems do. So that makes a lot of sense. All right. Thanks for sharing that behind scenes stories and insights with us. I guess now we'll let Thelonious take it away. Just one thing. I think Mitya has to leave in about 1 hour and 15 minutes. So maybe let's make sure we finish the presentation like 45. Okay. I'll stop share and share.
Cool. And
Oh, do you want to also have to? No, my computer is actually the main connected to the main source.
oh,
So maybe you should.
I'll mute.
Yeah. And also,
Can folks hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
Great. Good. Hey y'all. So Thelonious Cooper. I appreciate you all having me here today. And I posed this paper to the Journal Club because it really struck a chord with me personally. Coming from, I'm a first year PhD student in electrical engineering right now. Coming from, I just graduated at MIT where I studied mostly signals and systems with kind of an emphasis on efficient sensing and control, and then followed that with digital systems, but this is more on the control side, of course. I found I've taken a liking to kind of theoretical neuroscience and all these things. I think, as you alluded to, it's a really fascinating and like very. It feels like there's so much room for exploration compared to maybe some other fields. Yeah, so that's, I won't get too much into myself at this point, but I'm very interested in kind of these theoretical models, and so I thought this was a fantastic direction. So you kind of start by just talking about, motivations of, this is the last group I need to explain this to, but it's like, collections of neurons, obviously are receiving some sort of stimulation and are outputting things, so they're spiking. If we want to consider them to be acting, then our brain is in a whole body sensory motor loop. So everything we do affects how we feel, and everything we feel affects what we do. And so this is kind of the big paradigm. This is nobody disagrees with this, right? So coldest take of all time. But the thing is that it's not very satisfying, right? Because it's not particularly prescriptive. It's often not particularly causal, so it's not clear kind of what is actually doing the controlling or doing the sensing, especially given that neurons are fundamentally, so densely connected, and very few of them are actually connected directly to the world. And I think that that's something that's maybe sometimes overlooked because the reality is that from the perspective of any given neuron, it only ever talks to, other neurons. There's nothing else to the world for any given, central neuron than, other neurons around it. And so I found this was very exciting because it didn't, any kind of global, the optimal, solution can't rely on these kind of things that we've grown to depend on in terms of even modern control theory is much more in the centralized, take in as much data as possible, and then make some decision and broadcast it to everywhere that you need to do that. And this has always been dissatisfying to me, in part because most of coming from computer engineering background, this is an energy nightmare because the communication overhead just completely dominates the actual computation. And so I found this very exciting, and I've been also interested as I've been kind of indoctrinated into the cult of normative modeling, where so we basically are given something really complicated, and in the world of Einstein, we want a physical model that is as simple as possible and no simpler, right? So what no simpler means is anyone's guess, but I think the kind of baselines that we're interested in is that it explains the data, it reproduces phenomena that we don't have a good explanation for, and ideally, that helps us interrogate those phenomena. So, kind of the algorithm of normative modeling, you're given a pathetically simple description and some coffee. And then while the data is not described, you kind of keep adding more realistic constraints and recalibrating until you actually can generalize beyond just, the data that you're showing it initially. And then we can kind of investigate the model, declare victory, and then, maybe we'll, if we're bored, we can go and see if it actually yields any insights in the real system. All jokes aside, I think I don't want to get too jargony. I think I have kind of a weird background in terms of the stuff I've been exposed to, so I'm interested to make sure I don't over jargon anything. So just generally, I'm going to go over some terms, and I just want to gauge familiarity and then that kind of stuff. So one is like neo-soul music. Okay, some familiarity there. Statistical signal processing. Okay, very nice. Linear algebra, hopefully. That's a bit of a prerequisite for this one. Latin jazz, nice. Convex geometry, cool. Algebraic duality. Cool. Okay, so that one I'll go a bit more into. And pencil drawing. Okay, sure. So no worries if any or most of these are unfamiliar. If all of these are familiar too, then we should really grab a beer sometime. But let's get to life as a neuron, right? So I think we really have these kind of things is if we're bringing agency down to the level of an individual neuron, where it doesn't have this, it's not following marching orders from some other brain region, then it has to at some point actually just be operating with respect to its own kind of local variables in some sense. So we have internal state, which we can kind of take to be like ion concentrations, various signaling proteins and whatnot if we want to get more complicated. And then we can kind of have unseen perturbations. So from the perspective of the neuron, through whether it be gap junctions or synapses, it basically gets injected with ionic currents that it can't otherwise predict. So for example, like vesicle fusion, something just suddenly dumps a bunch of calcium into your system, and that's not a perturbation that it necessarily can it's deriving from itself, right? So and then the activity, if we want to assign this kind of autonomous notion to these, you could say, okay, it's just doing whatever, but I think the language of optimization here is very useful. So we can talk about it outputting its control as its membrane voltage effectively. And kind of so one of the main kind of central tenets of biology at this point is this idea of homeostasis. And this is also actually, by another name, a very fundamental principle of automatic control. The idea is just that you need to, if you have somewhere you'd like to be, you need to know where you are, and then you need to do something that will bring you closer to where you'd like to be. Very, very simple. But there's a little bit of nuance to it in that really there's this additional cost, right? Because we don't want to just do anything that could bring us to where we want to be, because there are potentially many different things we could do at any given time. And so we really want to be optimally lazy. And I think that this is kind of the personal goal of mine, I think is that I'm very interested in, designing systems, whether they be embedded systems, mechatronic systems and whatnot, that are as lazy as is physically possible while still actually doing what they're supposed to do. Because I think that this is kind of the right way, quote unquote, to do these engineering problems. I think, I could go on a tangent about, training a giant model and then shrinking it versus just building something that actually meets the specification. But I think kind of one thing that comes up is that if we're really trying to be optimally lazy, it's actually not just enough to know what the current perturbation is. Because the thing is, if we know what the perturbation coming in is, or what it's going to be very likely, so for example, it gets warmer in the morning, then we can counteract that before it even occurs. And oftentimes that is actually more energetically favorable. And so this kind of idea that things are doing, further prediction in order to preemptively, be in their desired steady state is this idea of allostasis. And so it's a, slightly different hypothesis, but ultimately they're operating under the same goal, and if you want to call it a goal, but it's that fundamentally we care about their ability to anticipate insofar as that it makes their lives easier and that they're doing less work. And so, we're going to go over the simplest possible model of a control system, basically. So everything is going to be linear, everything is going to be scalar, and the world is known. So this model is to neurons as dielectric spheres are to cows. And I choose this, example carefully because actually dielectric spheres can be a very useful model of cows. So, for example, in one of my first electrical engineering courses, we were talking about when can we justify these things or whatever, and if you have a herd of cattle or people walking under a power transmission line, then the geometry, which actually maximizes the surface potential with which lightning could strike from the tower, is a sphere. And so if it doesn't strike a dielectric sphere that has the same mass and radius of a cow, then it won't hit a cow. And that's what's important, right? So, yes, this is pathetically simple, quote unquote, but I think there's utility nonetheless. And so we're going to kind of lay out a few terms before we get too into things. So we're going to talk about input signals. So this is going to be basically, we can think of it as, the vector of this, each sequence of, the input values. And, in this setting, they're kind of also being fed back, but in general, we have also this state vector, and that's just going to be whatever we want it to be, really. I mean, so traditionally in electrical engineering, state variables typically correspond to energy storage. So, things like actually storing charge in capacitor and the fluxes throughout all of your inductors or whatever, those are basically what's the state of your system, and that's much more straightforward. But if you're just given the input-output behavior of a circuit, then there's really no principled way to say, oh, this is going to be the voltage on some capacitor. And so then we have the input to state map, and this is very useful because it basically will tell us directly how our input actually can influence the state, and it will become very important later for this notion of controllability. Then we have the dynamic matrix, which is basically just, given nothing else, what is our state going to do if we just let it run, right? And then we'll also have this observation covector. I note that this is a covector because it's not actually that it's filling the role of a functional that takes our kind of internal state and gives us a scalar notion of some projection of it. So, maybe a bit pedantic, but. And then we also have this idea of an input pass-through gain that actually winds up not being so important. And then finally, we have our output signal, right? So our output signal is just going to be whatever observation we have of our state vector. So our state evolution is going to be described just by we take in our input is mapped to our state and added, and then our state just does whatever, through its dynamic matrix. And then lastly, we actually observe out what the kind of effective projection of the state is, and also it has some term corresponding to the control that we put in.
So in the main goal for this simple neuron, is it to predict its future state? Or is it just to have
yeah, so we're about to get to that. And I think basically the idea is that if we make the notion that our state is our energy, we want to minimize energy, and so we'll basically be trying to drive x to 0. And we'll, given some initial state. And so, exactly, so basically, one pretty important question is that of feasibility. And I think that this is something that's kind of very central to old school control theory, but is something that's kind of unfortunately not so appreciated, I think, in kind of modern, particularly in reinforcement learning. I think it can be unfortunately overlooked because it's rather important. But key question is just, does there even exist a U that we could do that would actually remove the energy from our system? Because if we're saying that we're storing energy and we have some resistive loss or whatever, we don't want to have a bunch of stray ions or more than we have to, right? So the first kind of very convenient separation that linearity allows us is that we can actually treat this as basically two systems. So there's the zero input system, which is basically just takes our state, our initial state, and evolves it linearly, only with respect to the dynamic. And then there's the part which only depends on our input and has no influence from the initial state. So, in mathematical language, homogeneous and inhomogeneous. Importantly, this inhomogeneous part is still causal, so it's only dependent on the previous values, right, of our control. And so something that we can consider is reachability. So basically, is 0 reachable in terms of the dynamic matrix A and input to state map B? It's nice that we can we don't actually have to care about what the initial state was. So basically, if we have full rank in some sense, we'll be able to get from anywhere to anywhere, regardless of what our initial state was. And so, if we want to get more complicated, we can partition it further. But the kind of central theorem is that, if we consider our system to be this 4-tuple, that we have a dynamic matrix, an input to state map, an observation, and a pass-through, then we can define this controllability or reachability matrix. And the idea is that this is basically just given arbitrary input, where are all of the places that A could take that input to be? And there's actually quite a depth here in terms of if you want to get into Krylov's subspace methods and all of this idea. But basically, the point is that if this matrix has full rank, then anywhere is reachable. If it doesn't, then there will be basically places which we'll just never be able to get to. And there'll be entire proper subspaces, actually. So it dramatically restricts the places in which we can operate effectively. So the next question is basically, how do we actually choose the U? So I just said that it exists. Nice. But that existence statements are rarely particularly useful in engineering. So without loss of generality, again, we just set the target to 0. And so then our norm we can choose that's particularly convenient is just the quadratic, which we can use to measure our success. So basically, how far away are we from having no energy at all? And we can solve that through just minimum norm. There's plenty of things we can do here. You can add your favorite regularizer, but ultimately it's going to be the argument minimum of this. And we also have a control cost, which is associated with outputting these things. So for example, if we have unbounded energy in the control that we need in order to stay at zero, then that's not really zero energy, right? So yeah. And we can express this rather simply in this algebraic term of basically don't be too concerned about it, but basically the idea is that based on where we are, we basically just can set the desired state as whatever will drive us to zero after the input map. Any questions so far? Cool. Okay. So this model kind of sucks, right? So if this is our neuron and X is our ions and all this stuff, this is good and fun. We have a nice closed form solution, but it presupposes a completely unreasonable amount of information. So basically, that's saying we can solve our problem if our problem wasn't really a problem to begin with. So if we knew everything about the world and we knew how it worked and we knew where we were and we knew how to get there, then we could get there. It's like, okay, well, not so useful, right? So the next step is basically which is the first assumption that we can break that actually is useful. And so people have actually taken each of these parts of the assumption and tried breaking them, and you get all these different methods coming out of that. But I think the one that Mitya takes in this, and that I find actually one of the most interesting and kind of more recent developments in control theory, is this idea that this notion of modeling the world can be really not particularly useful. So if we don't particularly know anything about the world, so we don't know the dynamic matrix, we don't know the input to state map, we don't know blah, 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 how can we actually do anything, right? So, because clearly we can do things and then we'll be able to maybe see that those affect things or don't, but Okay, so they can do with just data. So one kind of classical idea is system identification. And so this has been around for forever. And the idea is that, okay, sure, we don't know exactly what the dynamic is, and maybe we have kind of the rank of our model, we know how many capacitors are in there or whatever, but our tolerances are off. We just want to basically assess what the effective model is given some more information about it. So if you try and do this, you run into a pretty big problem, which is that there are actually an infinite number of matrices or these systems of four tuples which actually produce identical input-output pairs, not in like a approximate or asymptotic sense, but literally indistinguishable, right? And this is obviously a problem, but people have come up with different ways that we can address this. So one of the most common ways is basically to restrict the search space. So if we say, okay, never mind, we don't actually want to find just any matrix, but we want to find one that has some other nice properties. So for example, one is that we can fix the rank, which is already basically, if you were to try to optimize over the rank, it's extremely non-convex, right? So that's already a huge no-go. So we have to fix the rank, which is a pretty big assumption. And then we can say that we can fit the controller in what's called the canonical controllable form. And that's this. And basically, it's just that we've set almost all of the entries of our dynamic matrix to zero, except for these ones here, which are basically our integrator elements. And then we have our input to state map is basically just putting all of our input into just one state variable, because it doesn't matter anyways, given that we didn't know where it was going, right? So then our observation, we also have to figure out in terms of this arbitrary thing. And so you might notice that this actually looks very similar to an FIR filter, and that's because it is. So again, there are many methods for fitting these kind of systems. So it's a very large least squares problem. It becomes rather unwieldy. You have to make decisions before you can even do that. And then you also have, there's some algorithms which makes it a bit easier, but still, pretty significant problem, right? So definitely not something that, I don't think there's, a bunch of neurons which are collaborating to do Levinson-Durbin recursion on, the matrix to come up with some minimal solution, right? So, what's the alternative? Clearly this isn't really what we're going for. And if I'd ended there, then I wouldn't even start talking about the paper, right? So the point of this is that we can go into this idea of empirical mode decomposition. And so that's saying, okay, forget that we're even caring about some latent whatever. it actually turns out that just in terms of our input control state pairs and our outputs, we can basically reconstruct some very faithful description of the system. And this is kind of predicated on this idea of like Willem's lemma, which is that basically under semi-mild conditions, so basically persistence of excitation, which just means that there's no black hole in your input space where, you know, suddenly if you put things there, they just disappear instantaneously and then you can't track them, right? But future observations will actually lie in the span of these previous state control pairs. And that's, you know, a very useful property. This actually, it's worth noting that this is actually more general principle than just Willem's lemma, which is specifically about these linear maps. But actually, even if you go into nonlinear dynamical systems, then you can approach it with this theorem of Tawkins, which is Tawkins' embedding theorem. You know, I'm not going to get too far into it, but basically the idea is that even if you have some weird attractor structure or whatever, you can actually always perfectly reconstruct it just from the set, or you know, the topology of it just from the set of fixed lags. Yeah. So.
And this is kind of saying like you can only predict or like minimize what you've previously seen.
Yeah, so basically you can only minimize your regret. All you have is regret. You can't, there's nothing, you can try and make an inference about what the world was and then what the world is, and then compare those and then take the norm under some special thing. But you've really just done this big commutative diagram loop, and you could have just done the straightforward one, which would actually be called the Koopman operator composition. And the idea is, again, that basically all we care about is the accuracy of our ability to predict the system, which will later on become useful in controlling it. Then there's no point actually going to this this lifted space of the actual world in latent whatever. So basically, the statement is that for any time t, there is some k before that t, such that if we had the statements all up until that time, we'd be able to perfectly reconstruct it. And so, in this sense, and what's interesting is that so these are basically these sequences of x1, x2, xk, blah blah blah. These are covectors, and again, I make that distinction because G is the same vector for all of these, which is a weird thing, right? So that's actually not particularly intuitive, and I think that that's maybe a stumbling block that I just want to get over. And so the dynamical vector, we can think of it as, is actually the optimal t minus k step predictor of our inputs, basically. Actually, if we're given optimal kind of control pairs as well, then it will actually also be the t minus k step predictor of that optimal control. And so that's a very nice property. And so we can derive the optimal control, and I'll take one little step here, make sure everyone on Zoom is still following. Any questions thus far? I want to make sure. Okay.
Yeah, if there's any questions in the chat, I'll interrupt. And also, just to mention this, we encourage interruptions during the presentation because we want to have a conversation rather than a monotonic flow of information. So if you have questions, just unmute and ask.
So is it guaranteed that this, like the equation I showed earlier, that would actually have a solution?
Which one? So
from the previous slide, this one, the big linear equation.
Yes, asterisk, asterisk, right? So there's so there deterministically yes. If there's noise or you pick the wrong lag, then no, not necessarily. One nice thing though is that this is basically rank 1 at this point, right? So there's it actually, and this is something that will come up later, is that if all you have are these pairs, then it's actually not that useful to look much further ahead than one step, actually. So, being important. Yeah, and so we can derive kind of the optimal control then from this next step predictor, just in terms of we output some random stuff, and then based on how that affected it, we can actually from there predict what the optimal.
In the previous slide as well, if we're just taking the t minus k steps, would first input be t minus k and then some b?
Yeah. Oh, well, no, because it's not that it's yes, actually, so you could think of it in terms of this technically the G is specific to both T and K, right? So in that sense, if you wanted to slide it across, then you could do that, right? But in this sense, it's actually predicting beyond K. So it's not just predicting up to T, but it's actually there's a gap in between where it actually doesn't necessarily need to see these samples in between K and T. For suitable, K and T. Yeah, so it's the optimal predictor, right? And it's going to be the solution to this kind of algebraic, optimization problem. But it's kind of convenient because this is actually something that we can solve algebraically in this setting, right? So because everything was linear, it's really not so difficult. We have this more Penrose pseudo inverse, which is a bit bothersome. If you actually want to go through all of the algebra, which is not necessarily something I'd recommend, you could read the paper. They go very in depth, particularly in the supplement. But I think what I'm going to try and focus on is not the many expansions you can do in terms of everything, but basically what the actual kind of intuition is. What's up?
Is that A like the actual true system A? Or
Where?
oh,
sorry. This is just a notation for what the more Penrose pseudo inverses.
Yeah, but I'm saying so we have
this isn't the A.
It's more
sorry.
Penrose inverse of the X like this.
Yeah, but this is just the definition in the bracket. Okay. Sorry, that's maybe confusing. I'll fix that later. Submit the slides, but yeah, not the same A. Sorry, that's notational blunder. But yeah, so some useful notation here is that we can kind of talk about just the one shifted copy of X, also as a covector, and then we can describe G as basically this pseudo inverse of this outer product here, or actually just the pseudo inverse of the stack. So then our kind of state feedback law we can interpret as being some W, or basically our weight, which we're going to apply to our state in terms of, and then that W will actually be derived from just the previous values of state and control that we put up. And something that's kind of cool is that we actually formulate this almost entirely in terms of these kind of like outer products or inner products. So we can think about it, it lends itself very nicely to these kind of statistical notions, right? So something that we can think about is, we can talk about cross covariances, right? So the covariance of F and G, and then, assuming they're wide sense stationary, pretty mild conditions, we can basically have that the parameter to our FG will be that basically the covariance at the shift between them. So F of 0 times G1 conjugate. This winds up being the optimal W. Again, there's some algebra. I'm not going to go too in depth. You can, again, read the paper. This is not the formula that they have in the paper, but this is just rephrased in terms of these basically covariances, because they actually wind up basically being. And Mitya, feel free to correct me, otherwise. And in terms of these, basically wind up being the point estimators of these values. So they're not actually necessarily the true covariance, but they're as good as we could get. And this is not a particularly intuitive result. So this is our answer. Woohoo, we're done, right? we solved our model. I think this is where interpretation becomes interesting, right? So basically what we're saying is that it's proportional to this kind of 0 is a bit misleading because it's not actually, the U is actually slightly delayed. So we can think about this as, if we think about the limit from X coming from the left to U basically winds up being the coincidence of our pre and postsynaptic signals. Right? So if we have a postsynaptic signal which is very strongly correlated with exactly what we just got in, then that says something about how we should change our controller, right? And we also have this term here is when we divide out by the variance here, and then we have this normalization constant, but you'll notice this actually bottom part doesn't depend on the control at all, right? So really this is the more interesting part. And we can say, when we divide out by the variance, then we get this correlation factor, right? So this is basically the correlation between our current, input and, the input sometime in the future. Again, these will be point estimates, right? So they're not.
The input sometime in the future or the output sometime in the future?
So for here, the correlation is between the inputs now and sometime in the future. Equivalently, you can think about it as previously and now, because they're wide sun stationary, you can basically be symmetric, states. Right? Yeah. And then we multiply that by the covariance of our U, so basically our output with our future input. And so basically this is, we can interpret it as basically saying that ideally our output is actually correlated with, or covaries with our input. Otherwise, there's really not much to do, right? And so kind of if we think about how it's changing with respect to X, this is where I think it's really becomes very interesting interpretation-wise, and this is really what drew me to the paper, was the idea that basically it's that this can be kind of associated with, if my previous output suppressed my current input, by the best of my estimation, then I should actually increase it. So basically, I want to suppress it as much as possible. So if it's already suppressing it, then I should suppress it more. And the kind of so that we can think of that actually very strongly as potentiation, right? And then in the neuron analogy again, we have this other term which correlates basically depression. So basically, it's that if my output is covarying, and again positively, so basically if my output is making my input worse, then I definitely shouldn't do that, right? But that's actually weighted by this idea that my input is self-correlated, right? So if my input is, totally uncorrelated with itself, so it's just IID, then, there's not really a point in, worrying about how my output's doing anyways, right? And so, and because this correlation is always between 0 and 1, this is a very interesting kind of idea that, there's not previously been good explanation for, is that depression is weaker than potentiation. It's asymmetric in this kind of bizarre way that seems like it's this kind of like acausal weirdness, but when you interpret it as basically this feedback rule, then it actually becomes very intuitive. That basically, if my input isn't, it's likely that my input actually isn't very strongly affected by my output at all, right? So in that case, in general, without perfect knowledge of that my output will influence my input, then the depression will always be weaker, right? And so this is basically, the victory lap is that now we can kind of investigate some really interesting qualities of this model. So remember, we took the simplest possible model we could imagine, and we broke just one assumption. And we're already getting pretty cool stuff out of this, right? So we have this idea of noise-dependent stability, which is wildly unintuitive, just from a biological, physiological standpoint. But, if you inject some fixed current, this has been known for a very long time, then you get this, variability in the spike timing, and we can vaguely think about it as variability in the actual rate function as well. But if we have noise injected, then it becomes actually shockingly regular, like very bizarrely so. And so this is over multiple trials, and so it's not just that it's over time, but actually just within the same noise cycle, it does exactly the same thing. And that's kind of weird for a physiological system to do, right? So the fact that noise is actually making it better at, being more stable is a counterintuitive fact that actually arises very naturally from the math, which is cool. And the idea is that, so basically this is the top is this deterministic case. And the idea is that if we actually switch our system instantaneously here, so we are in a switch linear system, then basically the problem is that we can enter these gray regions are basically where the weight actually leads to an unstable system. So this is a pretty catastrophic failure for a neuron that's actually just making its life much more difficult. So not only not working, but actually being counterproductive, right? This is bad. But then when you actually inject some amount of noise into it, it just works, right? And so that what's interesting here is that we can interpret this all the way back in terms of this, right? So if these are deterministic, then if at some point the dynamic switches, this never actually recovers full row rank, right? So we never get this much back, further back than I thought it would be. right? So, okay, so if this A suddenly switches, then in the absence of noise, our controllability matrix basically becomes rank deficient, and so we lose our ability to actually infer anything about it. But in the presence of noise, we basically actually have a much better estimate of the kind of influence of us on our system, because we basically have these perturbations that almost guarantee orthogonality, or not orthogonality, but non parallel. So it's almost impossible for it to just be completely degenerate in the way that it would be if it was deterministic. And this is a very cool result. I mean, so the idea, I'd seen kind of this spiking thing before, and it always just was kind of bizarre. I was like, yeah, I don't know. You can kind of chalk it up to, there's these ideas of like stochastic resonance in the brain and whatnot, but it's kind of hand wavy, and I've never found that very satisfying, particularly because there's not usually some sort of actual description of how noise is useful, because usually, we describe stochastic resonance in terms of basically escaping basins, not in terms of stabilizing something. So this is a very cool effect.
It seems as if like the noise kind of forces the model to kind of generalize to only focus on bits that are that have meaning to certain outputs. It's almost as like a regularization term.
Yeah, so basically the idea is that it's very similar to this idea where it decorrelates the past with the present in a way that basically forces it to actually recognize that something has changed, right? So if under the assumption that nothing switches, then if something does switch, you're in trouble, right? But under the assumption that things are actually a little bit changing all the time, then you can actually track the change, even when it's an instantaneous switch, which is a really cool. And so if you can model a lot of systems as these kind of like switching linear systems. So this is a very adaptable controller, which is very, very cool. And so another, further really cool effect, I think, again, the simplest possible model with a single broken assumption reproduces this thing that wasn't really able to be seen prior, which is that if we think about fitting spike triggered averaging, it's experiments in terms of neurons, we can say that, okay, well, these neurons have receptive fields. This is Bluefy H1, and then also Drosophila. And it's very well documented that we have this feed-forward adaptation, right? So we can think about it, that there's some nonlinear dynamic. We have the leaky integrator. There's this exponential or kind of rectified notion, and so it's traditionally seemed to be kind of coming from this, but something that has actually always been statistically significant but was never accounted for was that if you imagine it as having both feed forward and feedback terms, that the feedback terms are actually also adapting in a way that is not described by the mechanism you would suggest for feed forward adaptation. And so this is very, very interesting. And so this is not, I will say that this doesn't necessarily account for the feed forward adaptation, but it gives a separate account that accounts for this thing which was completely undescribed prior, which is, I think, very cool. And so particularly in the setting where, in Drosophila, the idea is that all neurons would adapt, right? And so if we only looked at feed-forward terms in Drosophila ORN, we'd basically say, oh, that's weird. It's not adapting at all. But if we look at feedback terms, now we can say, oh, no, it actually is statistically significant. These red lines are where the difference is statistically significant, because there's not that many data points. So don't read too much into like these little things here. But this is a pretty significant difference that it actually is undergoing adaptation. And I think that's a pretty significant result neurophysiologically, that there probably are not any neurons that are not adapting. And previously, you could have kind of made that argument, but I think that's rather dead in the water. And so that's kind of wraps up the kind of main discussion. I definitely want to leave some time for Mitya to go into kind of further developments that they've done. I think I'll run through a few personal speculations briefly, and then hand over the floor. So speculation, so there's still other assumptions that we can break, right? So in order of kind of my very subjective estimation of difficulty, so in no particular order, I think one interesting idea is that we can go from linear in state to linear in observables. And so this is a big kind of movement in terms of Koopman operator theory, in dynamical systems, that basically there are almost no modern dynamical system papers which don't refer to Koopman operator theory at this point, because it's so useful. And the idea is that if we have these nonlinear observables, then we can almost always describe some system which is linear in these observables, even if it's very nonlinear in some subset, basically. And this is interesting from the biological or biophysical perspective, because we can imagine that these observables are things that the cell actually doesn't necessarily have control over. So things like reaction mechanisms, right? So there are a lot of processes where, if we have membrane potentials, they're rectifying or they have other weird shapes. And these are not things which, it can just kind of decide on arbitrarily. They're dictated just by the biochemistry, right? So this is, for it to be linear in these additional observables would also kind of be reasonable, I think, and it could maybe explain further as kind of the nonlinear dynamics there. And then the very exciting, I think, would be to further, I actually gave a talk a couple of weeks ago on kind of going from Gauss-Markov inference to point process inference in a very principled way. So we can basically go from this kind of like linear quadratic estimation just in terms of this discrete time and continuous amplitude observation to just actually looking at continuous time with these sparse event observations. And I think that this has been shown to really well actually model phase selectivity in humans and other animals in terms of rhythmic rhythm identification. That's where this work comes from. Jonathan Cannon studies runs the Meter Lab at McMaster, where he talks about basically rhythmic entrainment and people who have rhythm and don't have rhythm and brain differences there. And so I think continuing that kind of line of work, in relation to this idea as going from just purely being an observer phenomena to actually maybe we can also develop adaptive control just in terms of these event potentials, I think is very exciting. So this is the citations, and I'll hand over the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Thelonious.
Right on time.
Yes, great. Maybe we can take a few questions and then, okay, okay. Mitya, feel free to share and can get started on your part of the presentation. But also we can do questions first. Maybe like if you have a few lingering questions.
I have a quick question about the idea with like the noise stability. So if I was understanding correctly, like, so you have like the time lag to find your dynamic vector G, but then like up to some time, and then like after a certain bit of time, you like kind of slide the window up, keep on sliding it and finding.
You can slide it every time step by one.
So if we're sliding this G at every time step, like we're like kind of like doing a new optimization problem at every time step, how come in the deterministic case that G wouldn't still adapt if you're just sliding?
That's a good question. So the reasoning more has to do with that you basically you're not actually doing a new optimization problem each time, right? So you basically adapt, and then you basically do these rank 1 updates. And so if these rank 1 updates don't have the adapted system in their span, then you can't get to them, basically.
There's one more question from Marta, and then the next section.
Hey, thanks for the nice talk. I'm wondering how this model basically deals with the different temporal scales, that all these different physiological examples which you mentioned are recorded for and registered for like a kind of, I like the approach and the model very much, especially that you put it so nicely into your jargon, in your language. And I indeed see a lot of, neurophysiological theories in every step, which adds to it. But I'm like wondering how this model deals with time notion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. Realistically, all these biophysical processes also, even like the signaling observables and whatnot are all happening at, very different timescales, from the single, atom, bindings and all of these things, but all the way to, minutes and, long-term learning and all of these things. But I think that one kind of, well, I'll put it this way. I don't have an answer for you, but I I have potentially useful speculation, right? So I think,
Yeah, maybe we can speculate a little bit later about this. Yeah, I'm curious about, that's actually very interesting to me. Like,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it's very exciting. I mean, I think that one idea is that basically you can actually have so some work I've done in actually just purely in signals literature is this idea that you can basically almost always break down these systems into an ensemble of single step predictors, right? And so this ensemble, corresponds to the diagonalization of the state space model. And this is becomes a very effective methodology. I actually did this completely. I expected to talk about this because this was basically to remove the latency from audio processing systems. But yeah, so basically the idea is that if the different parts of the cell are likely operating slightly differently, and so if they're each operating in kind of sum to having slightly different values, then they could actually wind up having very long temporal extent and very short responsivity. And then another kind of hypothesis is that if you have a big network of these things, then they'll naturally organize in terms of powers of the time scale, right? So you'll wind up getting dynamics at tau to the 2, tau to the 3, etc.
Okay, so basically you mean there are ways to figure it out.
Yeah, I think that's I don't think that's like a huge hole in the theory necessarily.
Okay, cool.
Okay, thanks again, Theo, and Mitya, take it away.
Well, first I want to compliment Thelonious doing such a great job. I mean, I love the presentation. I think I thought everything was correct, and I love the background and the setting and the context and the energy, and it was just like such a great experience. I hope you share my feelings. But speaking of the holes of the theory, so can you see my slide?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I listed some, and I think some already came up in the questions. The first one is, what's the objective of the neuron, right? And what we said in the paper, well, if it's a feedback loop, it better be stable, right? Otherwise, it blows up. There's no choice there, right? But if that's the only thing that the neurons want to do, that's not very exciting, right? You just lie down and die, right? That's very stable. So there has to be some other, goal-directed objectives, right? The second thing is that, well, it's actually not a general problem with direct data-driven control, but what we did is a single-step policy, right? Like you get to the desired state in one time step. That's of course because the dynamics is scalar and it's too simple of a problem. Anyway, but it would be nice to have something that has a longer time policy to maybe make a connection with the experiment. The third thing is that optimal policy is basically some version of LQR, and it's of course linear, right? So that the output of the neuron is a linear function of its input. But we all know that for biological neurons, that's not the case, right? So what's going on here? And this was just like so perplexing to me for many years. And I think now we can give an answer to that. And the final one is, I think, really minor that, well, we consider deterministic dynamics of the environment and we added noise in the controller just to fix the persistence of excitation problem for the Williams lemma, as Thelonious said. But the environment is not fully predictable. It's not deterministic. It's stochastic, right? Both biologically inside the brain, other neurons in the brain, and around us, right? Like we can't fully predict what is going to happen to the world. So, well, we came up with another formulation, which is a slight tweak on we had before. Still, as Thelonious pointed out, the simplest possible thing we can do, okay? But trying to address those issues. So here it is. So let's see. Okay, so instead of postulating a stabilizing objective, that is, we have an unstable system, well, we still have an unstable system, okay? But what the goal now is not to stabilize it, to stay in the fixed point, but the goal is to transfer the state across the fixed point. Okay? So suppose we're starting on the left and we want to go to the right. Okay?
Wait, I think I don't understand. So in the previous objective, you wanted to stabilize by putting the state of the system to 0. Now you have
Yes.
unstable fixed point. Does that mean that the state of the system is evolving and you're tracking it, or are you trying to bring that back to 0?
So the autonomous dynamics is exactly the same as before, right? So actually, it's written here. X dot equals kx, okay? That's the same as before. And then we have the control u. But the goal now is not to drive x to 0, but instead to drive x from left to right of the fixed point. So to go across the fixed point. Okay?
What is the motivation for this objective?
Well, I mean, imagine that you're walking, right? And when you walk, like in every step, you're like doing this transfer, because when your weight is on one leg, right, it's an inverted pendulum. So it has an unstable fixed point when your center of mass exactly on top of your footprint. But you start a little bit behind, and you have to carry your weight over to be a little bit in front of it. Okay, and then you plant the other foot, right? But basically, in every step, you're doing this transfer.
Exactly.
Make sense?
Yeah. Another question in the room?
Okay, so like almost like in order to get to this like 0 energy state for X, you'd need to pass through many unstable fixed points. It's that passing through the unstable fixed points that you're trying to do.
I mean, in general, there are many, right? It's nonlinear dynamics with many unstable fixed points, but we are considering only one, right? And in terms of potential, you can think it's like a hill, okay? And you just have to like go over the top of the hill to the other valley. That's the goal, okay? And if you plot this force, it will be, this is kx, right? So the force is just proportional to x. That's like a linear expansion around a fixed point, just like a Taylor series, and we take the first term. Does that make sense? Or yeah? Okay. So we want to go from the left, say from point minus A to the right, point A, but as Thelonious already pointed out, just getting there from here is not really difficult. You just like take the system and carry it over. Of course, you want to do it under energetic constraints, right? So you want to minimize, right, the total quadratic cost. That's a usual convention in control theory, because it goes well with the linear dynamics and gives you nice linear solutions over the time that it takes to cross from minus A to A, right? So that's the that's a rigorous optimization problem formulation for this control problem of like crossing the unstable fixed point like in one. Okay? So that's the only difference basically from the formulation before.
So can I ask a philosophical question about choosing different objectives or measures of optimality? It seems like there are as many measures of optimality as there are tasks out there, and this is just one more measure of optimality that is different from your previous one. But
so let's be a little bit. It's a good question. Let's be a little bit careful. Measure of optimality is still u squared, just like before.
Wait, no. I mean the unstable fixed point, like that you want to go across that. The energy, right. I fully understand. It's totally fine. But just trying to say that the system wants to cross this unstable fixed point to the other side, as opposed to what it wanted before in your previous paper. I'm just saying that objective, the outcome that you desire or a preference, there's probably a lot of task dependence there, and you just have to come up with whatever makes sense for your task.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So we have to choose a task, and I chose a different task now than I chose before.
Okay.
The question is, what's a better fit for neurons,
Cool. Okay.
right?
Makes sense. Yeah.
And I'm going to show you something which hopefully will convince you that this is a better fit.
Okay.
And the reason is that this problem can be solved exactly, and we did that. But I won't give you the solution for finite time because it actually is a little harder. I'll start with the solution for, what control theory is called free horizon, unlimited time. Okay, so you just want to go from -A to A. Doesn't matter how long it takes. Then amazingly, we can solve this problem exactly. And the solution, the optimal solution, is what we call a double or nothing control law. And that what it means is that on the left side, you apply twice the autonomous force, minus twice the autonomous force, minus 2K. On the right side, you do nothing. Why does that make sense? Well, because remember, to get from left to right, you only have to fight the autonomous force to the left of the unstable fixed point. And you have to turn the sign of that force to be positive so that the total force is positive, okay? On the right side, you don't need to do anything. The system will carry you for free. So that's what explains it. Why is it exactly 2? Why is it -2? That's the outcome of optimization of this quadratic cost function. If you know LQR, there is a solution of LQR where you take the state cost to 0. It's called cheap state limit, and that's where you get twice the factor. Okay, just optimizes that integral. Okay, that's it. And except that it's one-sided. So basically, what we get is that the control law can be independent of time, right? Output U is just this value function of X, right? So like neural nets, right? Value, okay? And that neuron will take you across the unstable fixed point in an optimal sense in terms of cost.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you say, well, it's task dependent, right? So, I may want to go from left to right, or I can go from right to left. Okay. So what do I do? Well, for the right to left task, I need a mirror neuron to this, which is actually like going down here. So it applies negative force on the right and applies no force on the left, just like a mirror reflection. So if I have a circuit of 2 neurons like this, they are coupled by reciprocal inhibition so that it's winner take all. So only one of them is active at any given time, that it can drive the system either from left to right or from right to left, depending on which neuron is active.
Yep.
So that's basically like how we kind of improved on this previous DDDC. And, there are other things like adding noise, adding higher dimensions and stuff that we are working on. And we already have like a proof of principle data-driven implementation of this. But basically the idea is that this simple tweak of changing the control task allows you to get much more realistic in terms of neurons and get, potentially explain such ubiquitous feature of neurons as nonlinearity or rectification. So I just wanted to put that on the table because, I knew some of these questions would come up. And so, I admit that was, a limitation before, but hopefully now you will see a better connection with neuro. Thank you.
So just the way to think about this, in your previous objective of just bringing the activity to X to 0, that allowed you to, explain this very interesting biological phenomenon of STTP. Now you have this other more, let's say, relatively more sophisticated optimality or objective, and that allows you to explain existence of like preludes, or nonlinearities in neurons. And it seems like this circuit that you have down here I don't know if you really mean like what is I? Is it like an inhibitory neuron or interneuron? What do you think about? How do you?
Yeah, it's inhibitor interneuron.
Okay, so you have like a more sophisticated neurons with nonlinearities because of this new objective. Is that the way to think about it?
It's just because, we're trying to move on from like having a single neuron brain to have a two neuron brain. And so, there are different contingencies. There is a task for going left to right, like
Yes.
walking forward, and then there are tasks from right to left for going backward, right? If you're walking. And so we want to have two neurons that are plugged in, right? They can be the same neuron, but they're two neurons that are plugged in. And then the inhibition enforces competition. So if the plus neuron is active, it suppresses through the interneuron, the minus neuron, and the other way around, right?
Yep.
So that's the idea. But, because the control law is the same as before, right? I expect we haven't gone through the motions actually to calculate the learning rule, time-dependent learning rule. But I think it will be very similar control law to what we had before. I anticipate that would be the case.
Very cool. I actually have a question about noise, but I don't know. Do you have like more slides or should I ask it?
I can. I do have another slide, which is basically like takes this to two dimensions, right? If you have like a settle point, right, in two-dimensional dynamics, and the instability is this right direction, and this direction is stable. So you enter from the like upper left, and if you're above the solid black line, you go left to the undesired state. That's not where you want to go. But if you enter to the right, you will end up in the desired. So the way to think about it is like the same as 1D thing in that direction, but then there is a stable direction added on it. Okay. And then, the question is like, can you solve it and you have a similar objective? And now you can even add noise. And, it's like usual drift diffusion model, again, can be solved for quadratic cost. And this is the solution where, you have this ReLU function just as before, but only at zero noise, it's exactly ReLU. When there is finite noise, then it kind of gets smoothed a little bit. Why does it get smooth? Well, because imagine that you entered this a little bit to the left of the midline. Sorry, you enter this to the right of the midline, but in the deterministic system, that will guarantee you'll go to the desired set. But in the noisy system, you can get a stochastic kick, crossover, and end up in the undesired. So you need to start controlling even on the favored side. Okay. And that's why it started cropping up, sort of preemptive control, right? And that's why you get that. Actually, interestingly, you get the same effect if instead of infinite time, you require finite time for the deterministic system. So that's pretty much what we generally get, this kind of like smoothing of this ReLU. So that's basically like, there's more stuff, but I think that's kind of like probably not worth taking more of your time.
This is really interesting stuff. Again, here in your slide, there's, noise changes the properties of the system. And in your paper, it was also a very important addition, as far as I understood. So I wanted to ask you, do you like to also, like another dimension to extend your framework is to just move towards embrace probabilistic control. Everything is probabilistic. What are your thoughts on that? Have you considered that? Do you think that's a good idea, or do you think it's not the right way to approach this problem?
Well, yeah, you can say that in this formulation that I put on the slide, it's actually already probabilistic. Like I did not, okay, it's a little abuse of notation, right? But once I have stochastic noise, right, this is a Wiener process, right? So once I have that, I cannot say that I'm minimizing the control cost, right? Because I have to minimize the expected control force, because this has to be run for different instantiations. So this, in fact, is already all probabilistic. I just did not want to complicate things too much.
Yeah, you can just,
Yes.
that like apply just the Fokker-Planck equation and look at the distribution of trajectories rather than. So it is. I think this slide is fully probabilistic, but in your paper, the reason I'm asking this is because I wanted to ask this follow-up question. It seems like this LQR objective that you have in your first paper, you can derive that from a log likelihood term plus a Kullback-Leibler KL regularizer term. And if you actually make this connection, then you can see that that objective can be also interpreted as your model is doing just variational inference. I'm not sure about the math. I haven't done it, but it just, as I was reading last night, it occurred to me that this probably there's like a connection there. So it is inherently probabilistic in that sense. But then you add that noise to your output of the neurons that stochastic noise is basically just sampling from the posterior of neurons. Have you thought about this yourself, or do you think this is like too far-fetched?
That's a really good question. So let me break it up into two. The
Okay.
first thing that you said, I think, was this is like Langevin equation on the slide, right?
Yes.
That I put up, or Ornstein-Uhlenbeck. But you're saying, well, but probabilistically there is a complementary description, which is actually the same, right? Which is Fokker-Planck in terms of the distribution of trajectories. So I 100% agree with you on that. And in fact, the way we solve this problem is through going through the Fokker-Planck equation, because that offers, well, you can do it both ways, but we actually, in this paper, we went through the Fokker-Planck and we solved this thing called the commuter, which is basically like all probabilistic quantities. It's all like probabilistic and all that.
Okay, nice.
Okay.
So you fully embrace probabilistic in this paper.
Fully embrace it. But control, is deterministic still. The controller is deterministic, right? Z is a deterministic function of X. Okay. So the way like the stochasticity comes in is through the stochasticity in the environment. Okay. So that's that. Now, then you said, well, but in the DDC paper, actually the control was probabilistic. So, and that is true. And that we have not developed further. Now, you suggested that it is related to an inference problem. And this is a very interesting link. I would love to chat with you further about this if you're interested. I think this is right. I kind of like would say words like, okay, you have exploitation, exploration, trade-off. And if you're deterministically controlling its exploitation, if you control with noise, it adds exploration. One way to capture it is through variational inference. I think I'm in complete agreement with you. We have not done it. I would be happy to discuss this with you. I think it's a very interesting direction.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely follow up with you offline because I think this connection is really rich. It connects two seemingly different sides of literature that are doing the same thing, but different terminology, I think. So yeah, I'll definitely cross the T's and dot the I's, and I'll follow up with you on that. I also wanted in the last 5 minutes, because this is we are running this RL debate series. So I wanted to ask your opinion about reinforcement learning. One way to add goal-directedness to brains or whatever agents is to just tell them, oh, yeah, they're maximizing some reward. The green parts, the desired parts have more rewards and undesired have less rewards. Have you thought about reinforcement? What are your thoughts about RL?
So, I mean, first of all, I have to qualify this because I'm not a big expert on RL. But I'm also I think in my mind, there are certain limitations to RL that actually I think Rich Sutton himself also mentions, that I think there's an impression that it's not a completely, finalized framework. And my intuition is if we move in that direction from the side of control theory, I think there could be something very interesting there and actually very neurally relevant. There are, there are experts who are speaking out on this now. Like I saw a post from Bertsekas, who actually, I think he mentioned that he actually has a whole lecture on that, of how control and RL share certain concepts, like value functions and dynamic programming and so on. But I don't want to to screw up his words, but I think his point is that the tractable part of RL can be achieved from the control perspective, right? Which I think that's what I heard. But we haven't done it.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about it in terms of the derivation for all these things, it's the same condition. I mean, one of the main reasons that we choose the LQR objective specifically from a control theoretic point of view is that it actually produces the Bellman optimality condition. So the dynamic programming you can derive the LQR control law as the solution to the Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation, and that this is actually how they actually typically solve it numerically, is that they describe it in terms of the cost to go, and then in finite time they'll solve it backwards with dynamic programming. So it's a this is possible because of the notion that this quadratic cost term is amenable to this notion of dynamic programming, where it has this fixed kind of distance property. It's monotonic and convex, and in the way that you actually can break the problem into a sequence of locally optimal conditions. This is not something that you can necessarily do in other types of objectives, and so that's why I'd say that the LQR objective, I mean, it's simple in that it's quadratic, but I mean, you could come up with other objectives, but this one is particularly nice, not just because it's quadratic, but because it has this very kind of generous interpretation.
So yeah, I guess they are totally 100% related ideas.
This is a very well-studied notion in control theory. I mean, I think a lot of the like early reinforcement learning literature was basically taking, I mean, a lot of even algorithmic developments in terms of dynamic programming as a computer science tool arose from this notion that the continuous time Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman solution was very successful in control theory, and then people realized that they could actually apply it to discrete tasks. And then once you generalize those discrete tasks to also having noise, then you get stochastic dynamic programming, which is just reinforcement learning, basically.
Yes. So we have to sit down and clarify these connections. And just going back to your point, Mitya, about like taking the control theory perspective, I'm totally with you there. By the way, you mentioned earlier that Sutton himself might be aware of the limitations of RL. I don't know, man. I mean, if you look at the paper "Reward is Enough," by David Silver and others, Sutton is the last author. I think they're making claims there that just are not true. I can get into that, but I think I don't find the notion of maximizing a reward, a scalar reward that is given to you by the environment, very appealing. But I like control theory, specifically probabilistic model-based control is my favorite thing to think about, in terms of, sensorimotor modeling, sensorimotor agency, whatever. And it's because it's more general. So you define some target, objective, whatever distribution, and your current state, and you want to minimize the divergence between those. You can squeeze rewards in there, but it's more than that. So that's why one of the reasons we're running this RL debates is to get to the bottom of this. And people are having different opinions. But yeah,
one of the most recent developments in this kind of like classical control aspect is this notion that you can most divergences you cannot generalize to also have this kind of global optimality association with the local optimality. But Bregman divergences you can actually do this with. And so there's been some work in recasting a bunch of the recursive quadratic cost terms in terms of this. And I think in terms of online control for things that are doing, control and inference without infinite history or even a fixed set of histories, I think that this notion becomes really important because, that I think the control law is only dependent on the current state or, the observer estimated current state, not that and 17 lags or 1700 lags or 17,000 lags, as would happen if you chose a different cost function.
By the way, Mitya, I know that you had to run, so we don't want to hold you longer than you can stay. So I just wanted to read this comment in the chat. Conceptually, are these ideas similar to Friston's active inference? Absolutely. If you call active inference model-based probabilistic control, it sounds less, I don't know, yeah.
Mystical.
Yeah, mystical. But yeah, they're very conceptually overlapping, or maybe like the same thing. Okay, Mitya, any
Yeah.
you want to share with us?
No. I do have to go. But if there are still questions, I just want to make sure if there is someone who wants to ask a question, I can do one last question.
Questions, people.
I guess my last question would be basically if you have any considerations in terms of generalizations to more point-wise, like point process type statistics, and if you're interested in kind of developing the theory towards these more event representations, which can be much more efficient, computationally, not just in neural type systems or biological systems, but also in computer systems.
Yeah, I think, I think what I'm hearing is like, are there going to be spikes in this controller neuron, right?
Oh yeah, so it could be that there's spikes, but even just if you can have the observer be running from spikes, or you could have the output also be spikes, and I think both is very interesting.
Yeah, so basically, I really want that. I would love to get spikes, like as all, most computational neuroscientists. I'm fascinated by spikes, but my kind of my guys are like, yeah, I don't know, taste. I sort of I would like to first get spiking as an optimal solution to something. Okay. And something non-trivial, like you could get spiking if you do some kind of like sparsity requirement, or some kind of like energy constraint. Yeah, I realize that, but I want to get it like from some sort of computational objective, which doesn't seem to require spiking. So just like here, we get a ReLU, we get a nonlinearity from a purely linear dynamics with quadratic cost, right? So for me, that kind of like, okay, then I can at least think that this may be an explanation. We don't know for sure. We never know, right? But then it becomes plausible. So I just want to derive the spikes first and then to use them.
Nice, that's very cool.
I really like this normative approach. Speaking like a true physicist there.
Yeah, sorry.
Deriving spikes from first principles. Let's go.
Cool. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the paper, and I appreciate Hadi for inviting me to talk, especially with such an audience.
Yes, appreciate you giving the talk, and appreciate you, Mitya, for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. All right, so
we can halt recording.
Yeah, we're gonna stop recording now.